well. Moving into Africa, and the seasonal rains don't look particularly active. We've got some of the wetter weather just near coastal areas across West Africa. It's a bit drier for Eastern Africa and across South Africa as well. A lot of dry weather here and some sunshine. It's going to be quite hot in the northwest of Africa, in the northeast of Africa and across the Levant as well. Those temperatures are quite a bit lower than they were this time last week and a bit below average as well. A lot of dry weather and sunshine really across the Middle East. The winds will be quite light. For many away from the northern areas, those temperatures are near normal for the time of year. The heat, though, is building across South Asia. We've seen temperatures 47 degrees, and that heat will continue to build. We've got some wet weather here in the south, but also some wet weather again around Bangladesh and the northeastern states, threatening some further flooding. And over the next few days, could get some heavy rain here across the southeast of China. The main weather front, the Meiyu front, is steering to the south of the main islands of Japan. So for the most part here, it'll be dry with some sunshine. Got a few showers in the north, as there will be across the Korean Peninsula as well. Dry weather with some sunshine for Shanghai and for Beijing. Wet for a while longer, I suspect, in Hong Kong. And we've got some more widespread heavy thundery showers across Indochina and the threat of some further flooding across Indonesia as well. Now, the weather down under is quietening down. We've got some stronger winds to come in through the Bight over the next few days. This weather front here is very weak. There's not much rain on that at all. So on the whole, it's going to be dry and there'll be some sunshine around as well. Nothing to write home about in terms of temperatures across the southeast at the moment. And for New Zealand, it's wetter in the North Island, but we could see some rain later in the South Island.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
Nothing says returning normality in Beijing like a traffic jam.
Brazilians are confused. Do they stay at home or get back to work?
In phase one of Spain's easing, Madrid is still under tight restrictions. So is half the country.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app. And get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amreliwala. Our top stories. Europe looks to relax border restrictions ahead of the vital tourist season. Greece allows domestic travel to its islands from today. We're there with a special report. The UK government is about to hold its daily briefing. They hope the row over the Prime Minister's chief advisor is over, but there have been more calls for Dominic Cummings' resignation. A warning to Latin America from the World Health Organization that now is not the time to ease restrictions as deaths in Brazil rise rapidly. And after a 2-month coronavirus closure, the New York Stock Exchange reopens its trading floor. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. European countries are taking more steps to get the continent back to some kind of new normal. Lockdown restrictions are being lifted as the fight against coronavirus pivots to opening up economies. Well, many countries in Europe are starting to relax their borders to get the vital tourist season going. In Greece, restrictions on domestic travel have been eased today, with people allowed to move around the country and to visit the chain of islands. In Spain, foreign travellers will no longer have to quarantine after July the 1st. The German government wants to end a travel warning to their citizens covering 31 European countries from June the 15th, if the coronavirus situation allows. And on the same date here in England, all non-essential retailers will be able to reopen. So let's start with this report from our correspondent Quentin Somerville, who's on the Greek island of Milos.
Athens is sending a flotilla to fight a pandemic. The Greek islands are reopening. Among the first to call, a high-speed deployment of doctors with a mission. These islands have been a safe haven from the pandemic with no confirmed cases of COVID-19. These medics from the mainland want to make sure it stays that way. It's an annual expedition to the remotest parts of the Aegean with special purpose this year.
We will be in contact with the government whenever they need us. We will come here to check if there's any case of COVID infection.
The mayor of Mykonos welcomes them ashore. We're greeted with elbow bumps instead of handshakes. There are enough tests for whoever wants them. There are only 250 people on this island, and none of them have been tested for COVID-19 until today. The village was built on a hilltop to safeguard it from pirates. They're hoping its isolation continues to offer protection. Greece has had only 172 deaths from COVID-19 and is leaving lockdown faster than expected. Bars and restaurants have reopened for guests. Hilary and David Brown live here.
We spend so much time here, we love it here. So even if there wasn't a pandemic and we were told to go home, we still would have chosen to stay here. It's safer.
There's no pandemic in the Cyclades. Only, I think, 2 in Syros and 1 in Mykonos, and that's it.
Father Theodoros leads the way. These tests are essential as Greece prepares to welcome back foreign tourists in the coming months.
Today is the first day that everything comes back to normal, including restaurants and all the borders and ships, so we are concerned about everything being as planned and the best possible way.
Greece is emerging from the pandemic earlier than others, not unscathed, but in better shape than most. Isolation is a way of life here, but so too is tourism. The health of the islanders depends on both. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, the Southern Aegean.
Now, we've reported before on the positive impact lockdown has had on the environment and pollution levels. Air quality has certainly been improved in many parts of the world. But have a look at this film by a French environmental organisation in the Mediterranean. You can see masks and latex gloves on the seabed. The group's founder posted the footage online and warned it could be the start of a new type of pollution. Now, the Americas are the new epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, according to the World Health Organization, who say now is not the time for restrictions to be eased. They are warning that outbreaks are accelerating in countries like Brazil, which currently has now the most cases in the world after the United States. And it's sticking with its advice there on the use of hydroxychloroquine as a possible treatment for COVID-19, despite the World Health Organization suspending trials of that drug. Let's head to Sao Paulo and our Latin America correspondent, Katie Watson. And Katie, let's start with those numbers and confirmation from the World Health Organization of the alarming acceleration of COVID-19 in Brazil now.
That's right. We're talking more than 23,000 deaths here in Brazil and more than 370,000 confirmed cases. But it comes at a time when here in Brazil, many states have either been in quarantine or lockdown for more than 2 months now. They locked down quite early, but yet we're still seeing a rise in the number of deaths. In the last few weeks, that has quickened its pace, not just in Brazil, in Chile, we've seen it, in Peru. So the World Health Organization saying now is not the time to lock down. At the same time, people here are frustrated. And certainly there are confused messages coming from the president compared to the state governors who have been responsible for the measures of quarantine measures and lockdown measures. And that confusion has meant that there's been a lot of concern over the deaths rising at an even quicker pace.
Now, Brazil, as I said there in the introduction, is pressing ahead with using this anti-malarial drug despite those concerns, the cancellation from the World Health Organization. Tell me, why are they doing that?
So the World Health Organization made this decision after a report in The Lancet looking at global figures, and the response was from the Health Ministry on Monday from Brazil that this is not a clinical trial. These are databases from across the world, and that is not a tough enough measure for Brazil to use that as a reference, and therefore they're ignoring it effectively. I mean, the Lancet in Brazil certainly have history. It was earlier this month, the Lancet said the biggest danger to Brazil was Jair Bolsonaro, the president himself. So Bolsonaro has been wanting to introduce chloroquine, antimalarial drugs from very early on, from very mild symptoms. And he's taken 2 health ministers who've disagreed with him. Finally, they've gone, so that he is pushing through with these decisions, despite, of course, medical advice that there are no benefits to the treatment.
A final quick thought on the travel ban with the United States that has been brought forward. The impact of that, and where are the public in all of this in terms of where Brazil now stands and the leadership they're getting?
Well, certainly it'll be a big sting to the government, who sees the US as a regional ally. The people who support Bolsonaro obviously are probably quite offended by it, but at the same time, I don't think anybody should see this as a surprise. Certainly his opponents are seeing this as a public shaming, an international shaming, that the situation's got so bad that even the US, which sees itself as, very much an ally of Brazil, is even having to take these measures, a measure of just how difficult and worrying the situation here is in the country, Brazil.
All right, Katie Watson for now. Thanks very much for that. Thank you. Now, if you were watching BBC World News at exactly this time on Monday, you'd have seen that long news conference given by the UK Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. It was to try to calm a huge political storm over whether he broke his own government lockdown rules. Well, let's get more from our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson. And Rob, clearly the government wants this to go away, but already today we've seen one political resignation of a junior minister and another senior Tory wading in to demand his resignation.
That's quite right, Matthew. You really know when you're in trouble, when your own side turns against you. And that has certainly been happening with several Conservative MPs after that rather bizarre news conference in the Rose Garden of Downing Street turning on Mr Cummings and indeed the Prime Minister. Now, we've picked out one, and that is a senior Conservative MP called Mark Harper. Interesting because he used to be a senior party manager, and we pick out a couple of the things that he's said, and they're rather typical. Actually, they're rather mild, but typical of what Conservatives have been saying. So, he says this business about Mr Cummings going up north with his family to stay with his parents. He says it's not a conclusion that many of his constituents, he writes, or people across the country would have reached. So that's a sort of dig at the perceived hypocrisy of the government. Now, he goes on also to talk about this very much mocked side trip Mr Cummings took to a local beauty spot while he was up north, supposedly to test his eyesight, saying there is no credible justification for that. And he goes on to say that an absolute minimum, he would have liked Mr Cummings to apologise or show some regret, which of course he did nothing of the kind yesterday. And then I think it's finally as the killer bit, really, saying that Mr Cummings himself should have offered to resign and the Prime Minister should have certainly accepted the resignation. As I say, Matthew, when your own side is writing letters like that, you know you're in trouble.
And when you add on to the politics, all of the apparent anger in so many sections of the public, you see why this is dominating the political agenda. We've had a latest poll in terms of the impact all of this has been having in the last 4 days. Take us through it.
Yes, absolutely. As well as being a political problem for Boris Johnson. Well, I guess I'd row back. This is nothing short of a public relations and political catastrophe for the Prime Minister, because you've got his own side, the Conservative Party, thinking, actually, is he really much good as Prime Minister? Not just the handling of this crisis with Mr Cummings, but going back to the whole of the pandemic. But then, I think more importantly in many ways, what you're alluding to there, Matthew, is a public relations, a problem with ordinary people, because this story has really cut through. And actually, it's not just anger. There's something else which governments must be very fearful of. They're being mocked. I mean, they're being ridiculed. The government is in danger of seeing its authority just seep away as British people love a good joke, and lots of jokes are being made about the government, and that does appear to be turning into a sort of measurable effect, if you like, in public opinion. So I think it's a company called Comres, and it's shown, I think it's a 20% drop in Mr Johnson's approval ratings in the last 4 days. And worth stating, Until recently, actually, the government and the Prime Minister doing rather well in the polls, with essentially the nation uniting behind the government at a time of crisis. I think you're absolutely clearly seeing that coming to an end, if not having decisively ended.
All right, Rob Watson, thanks very much for that analysis. Rob Watson there, our political correspondent in Oxford. I'll take you live to Downing Street, show you the pictures there, because the daily briefing has got underway. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, talking to the media. The initial statements being made will come away for now, but a little later when the questions start, we'll return to Downing Street and hear a little more of that. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. And Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam has defended China's new security law for the territory. The law would pave the way for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters to be charged with separatism and terrorism, and could see China set up intelligence agencies in Hong Kong for the first time. Protesters over the weekend were sprayed with tear gas by police, but more demonstrations are expected on Wednesday. The so-called gambling king Stanley Ho has died at the age of 98. He built a casino empire on the Chinese island of Macau that became bigger than Vegas. The success of Ho's businesses on the island have become an indicator of the overall health of the Chinese economy. And the supercar maker McLaren has announced that 1,200 jobs will be lost across its operations. That represents a quarter of its total workforce. The company has been struggling to deal with production during the COVID-19 pandemic and will spread the job losses across its Formula One, road car and applied technologies operations. Well, do stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, President Putin says Russia is past the peak of its coronavirus deaths. It's currently the country with the third highest number of infections.
In the biggest international sporting spectacle ever seen, up to 30 million people have taken part in sponsored athletics events to aid famine relief in Africa.
The first of what the makers of Star Wars hope will be thousands of queues started forming at 7 a.m.
Taunting which led to scuffles, scuffles to fighting, fighting to full-scale riot, as the Liverpool fans broke out of their area and into the Juventus enclosure. The Belgian police had lost control.
The whole world who will mourn the tragic death of Mr. Nehru today. He was the father of the Indian people from the day of independence.
The Oprah Winfrey Show comes to an end after 25 years and more than 4,500 episodes. The chat show has made her one of the richest people on the planet.
Geri Halliwell, otherwise known as Ginger Spice, has announced she's left the Spice Girls.
Ah, I don't believe it. She's the one with the bounce, the go, girl power. Not Geri. Why?
Welcome back to BBC World News. Our latest headlines here. Europe looks to relax border restrictions ahead of the vital tourist season as Greece allows domestic travel to its islands from today. A warning to Latin America from the World Health Organization that now is not the time to ease restrictions as deaths in Brazil rise rapidly. Now, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange has reopened for business for the first time in 2 months. It's been closed since the end of March as New York became one of the hotspots in this pandemic. Well, now a quarter of traders have signed a waiver allowing them to return to the world-famous trading floor. Our correspondent in New York, Samira Hussein, told us it was a good day for traders there.
For those traders that were very keen to get back onto the floor and to try and get some sort of semblance of normal, this is certainly the day for them. But remember that there's only about 100 or so traders, regulators, and operational staff that are allowed into the building, and even fewer than that are allowed onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And the way it looks actually on the floor is very different than business as usual. Everyone is wearing a mask. Everyone is subjected to temperature checks. You're not allowed to get within 6 feet or 2 meters of another person, no handshaking. And for anyone who has seen me do any live hits from the floor of the exchange, you'll remember just how busy it can get. And so keeping that kind of distance and not having as many people on the floor, it just means it looks like a very different place than what we have been used to.
Samira Hussein now to Russia, where Vladimir Putin says the country has passed the peak of its coronavirus infections. The country has the third highest number of cases in the world. But despite that, Russia's death toll is low at 3,800. In comparison, the number of deaths in the UK is more than 10 times that. Let's get more from our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg.
Well, so far in Russia, there have been more than 360,000 confirmed coronavirus cases. That makes Russia the third most affected country after America and Brazil. But the daily increase in infections, the number of new COVID cases, that does appear to be slowing. And certainly the message from the Kremlin is the situation here is stabilising. And to prove that point, this week, President Putin went back to work in the Kremlin. Today he said that the virus had passed its peak in Russia. He also announced that the Victory Day parade, postponed earlier this month because of the pandemic, will take place next month on June the 24th. Now, although the number of coronavirus cases here is quite high, the mortality rate is low. According to official statistics, fewer than 4,000 people in Russia have died from the virus. And in fact, the Russian government paper today spoke about the Russian miracle and said that Russia had passed the coronavirus test better than other countries. But there is some scepticism about the figures, and there are reports that not all COVID-related deaths in Russia have been included in the official statistics.
Steve Rosenberg. Now, as promised, let me take you to Downing Street. They're taking questions. They've just been asked with those announcements yesterday about easing the restrictions on shopping. We know that a certain amount of schools are going to reopen in June. Why aren't people being allowed to see their extended family? That's the question that's just been asked.
Secretary. Nearly 40 of your colleagues believe that the Prime Minister's top advisor let the country down and want him gone. Given that you stood there at that lectern and told people the guidelines weren't advice, they were instructions, do you feel that way, or at least see why your colleagues do too?
Well, thank you, Laura. On this question, Mr. Cummings has set out all of the details in quite extensive detail yesterday and then invited questions on it. My view is that what he did was within the guidelines. I can understand why reasonable people can take a different view, but my judgment, which is the same as the Prime Minister's judgment, is that what Mr. Cummings did was within the guidelines. After all, the guidelines allow for exceptional circumstances, particularly with regard to childcare. If you are, and we've stated before, that if you're unable to look after a small child, that is an exceptional circumstance. So I think that within the guidelines, Mr. Cummings acted, and the most important thing is that we can get on and deal with the other issues, for instance, those that I've talked about today on PPE and on treatments.
But, Health Secretary, do you admit that it's doing damage to the government's credibility and maybe undermining the message? I mean, you've just there at that lectern said, after a question from a member of the public, that you might review some of the fines that have been given to people if they were travelling for reasons to do with their children. This is making a difference, is it not, to what you're trying to do in government? No, I actually think that it's incredibly important that people keep their resolve. As we can see from the falling number of deaths, the falling number of hospital admissions, and as we stand up the increased test and trace capability, I think it's incredibly important that as a nation we keep our resolve. Everybody has a part to play in this, and everybody needs to act in a way that's responsible both for them and for their community. I think that I do think that's important, and I think it's important that we all stick at it. Thanks very much. Robert Peston from ITV.
Secretary of State, you and your wife tested positive for COVID-19. You have 3 young children, but you chose to stay at home in London. What is the relevant difference between you and Dominic Cummings?
The relevant difference, Robert, is that we had childcare readily available at home and Mr. Cummings didn't. Thanks very much. Ben Kentish from LBC.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Health Secretary, 71% of people disagree with you and the Prime Minister. They think Dominic Cummings did break the rules, and because of that, confidence in the government has plummeted 20 points in just 4 days. given how important that confidence is to pretty much everything you're trying to do, from maintaining social distancing to reopening the economy and getting people back to work, and the track and trace system that you're introducing next week, how much does that apparent loss of people's confidence worry you? And what do you say to those who say simply, that means you are risking people's health and the health of the economy, all people think, to save one number 10 advisor? What would you say to them?
Well, of course, I understand the anger that some people feel, and I regret the anger that some people feel. And Mr. Cummings himself said that, with hindsight, he should have got all these the facts out earlier. What I say is that it's incredibly important that, as a country, we focus on what we need to do now. And I've said this repeatedly through this crisis. You've got to wake up every day and work out what is the best thing to do next, and making sure, for instance, that we have the PPE available and that we protect people on the front line, making progress on these treatments, as I talked about. These are the critical next steps that we need to take, along with, as you said, making changes to the social distancing rules to allow people to get back to doing some of the things that they love. If you look at the earlier question from Ellie from Kent, it's all about how do we get back to a position where I can see my loved ones. These are the sorts of things that the country is yearning for, and I'm not underplaying the importance of the debate that there's been, and as I've said, entirely reasonable that reasonable people can disagree with the over what happened over the description of what happened over the weekend. But I'm here to focus on and really drive forward all of the other important things that we need to do as well. Thanks very much. Seb Payne from the FT.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hancock. Mr. Hancock, as we've just heard, according to a poll conducted today after that press conference, 71% of the public said after hearing Mr. Cummings' versions of the events, they believe his drive to Durham broke the lockdown rules. You've just said that it didn't. Are you saying that 71% of the British public misunderstood those rules? And if so, does that mean you as a government have failed drafting them? And also, if you don't mind me asking, would you now advise Britons to use that discretion on interpreting the rules, or is that discretion just for people who work in Downing Street? Thank you.
As I've said, it is incredibly important that people follow the guidelines. I was actually standing at this podium when the DCMO set out that clearly, as she put it, clearly if you have adults who are unable to look after a small child, that is an exceptional circumstance. And the guidelines were drafted with exceptional circumstances in mind. There were other exceptional circumstances that are set out that don't apply in this case, but describe some of the other exceptional circumstances that people face. Therefore, I think it is reasonable to conclude that the description of events that Mr. Cummings put out yesterday was within the guidelines. But I also, as I've said in answer, I think, to the first question, I do think I understand that reasonable people will disagree with that, and of course I understand.
Well, I was saying to Rob Watson, the government hopes that to get past the Dominic Cummings row, and you saw there from the questions just how difficult that is going to be, with the questions broadly around there, and one of the reporters referring to that poll, 71% of the public believe that Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules. I'm back with headlines here in just a moment or two. See you then.